Daniel stood under the flickering neon lights of a nearly empty grocery store parking lot, his hands trembling as he unfolded a few wrinkled bills. The total wasn't enough. Bread and milk, such simple things, were suddenly out of reach. Behind him, in the back seat of his old car, his two daughters slept soundly, wrapped in a worn blanket. Their tiny shoes poked out at the edge, a small reminder of the innocence he was desperate to protect. For a moment, Daniel closed his eyes and let out a weary breath. Life hadn't been easy since his wife passed away. Every day was a battle to balance work, bills, and the endless needs of growing children. Yet no matter how exhausted or defeated he felt, he carried a promise deep within him, to give his girls a childhood filled with love, even if he couldn't give them luxury. Whispering into the night, he said softly, "I promised them I'd do better," as though reminding himself not to give up. The parking lot was quiet, the kind of silence that magnified his struggle. Daniel wasn't just short on money, he was short on hope. He knew tomorrow would bring the same fight, the same counting of coins, the same question of whether he could provide enough. Still, he kept standing there, torn between going inside with what little he had or driving away empty-handed. In that moment, he wasn't just a man holding crumpled bills. He was a father carrying the weight of two small dreams, two fragile hearts who depended on him for everything. His love was bigger than his poverty, but even love, he feared, might not be enough tonight. And yet, he clung to it, because it was all he had. Evelyn had grown used to the quiet hum of grocery stores at night. It was one of the few places she could slip into without being noticed, away from the world of charity galas, luxury cars, and boardroom applause. Yet that night, her eyes weren't on the shelves of polished fruit or the cashier counting change. They were on a man standing just beyond the glass doors. His shoulders were hunched, his head bent low as he fumbled with a handful of worn bills. Something about him held her gaze. She watched as he looked toward the car parked under the dim light, where two small girls slept in the back seat. She could see the blanket barely covering their tiny bodies, their small shoes sticking out just enough to break her heart. It wasn't pity that stirred in Evelyn, it was recognition. For all her wealth, she too knew what loneliness felt like. She had money to buy anything, but not the warmth of a family to come home to. Drawn by an instinct she couldn't ignore, Evelyn left her cart behind and stepped outside. Her heels clicked softly against the pavement, but her voice was gentle when she called out to him. At first, Daniel stiffened, unsure of this stranger's intentions, but something in her eyes, something earnest, made him pause. She asked a few quiet questions, and he answered with honesty, not pride, not begging, just truth. A widowed father, fighting to hold his world together with nothing but love and determination. And then, before she could stop herself, the words slipped out, "Marry me, and I'll help you raise your daughters." It sounded outrageous even to her own ears, yet she meant every syllable. Her voice trembled, but her eyes held steady, shining with sincerity. For once, she wasn't offering money, she was offering her heart. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. The night air hung heavy between them, broken only by the faint sound of traffic far in the distance. He turned his head toward the car, where his daughters lay curled beneath their blanket, their chests rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Their innocence was everything he lived for, and the thought of anyone, no matter how kind, stepping into their lives for the wrong reason sent a tremor through his chest. When he finally looked back at Evelyn, his eyes weren't cold, but they carried a weight that words could barely hold. "I can't marry you for money," he said quietly, each word measured, almost fragile. Then, his voice steadied, filled with a father's resolve. "My girls don't need a millionaire, they need a father who shows them that love isn't something you buy." The truth of it landed in the stillness of the night like a stone sinking into deep water. Evelyn blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of his reply. She had expected surprise, maybe even hesitation, but not this. Not a man who would choose integrity over rescue, dignity over wealth. For years, she had been surrounded by people who measured worth in bank accounts and possessions. And here stood someone who measured it in love, in sacrifice, in the unshakable promise to two little girls asleep in the back seat of an old car. Evelyn felt something inside her shift. The world she built, the fortune she had amassed, suddenly seemed fragile compared to the fortress of love this man carried in his heart. For the first time in years, she felt small, not in weakness, but in humility. His rejection wasn't cruel, it was pure. And in its purity, she discovered a truth she hadn't known she was searching for. Evelyn stood in silence for a moment, her heart still echoing with Daniel's words. She could have turned away, retreating back into the comfort of her world, but something inside her refused. His rejection wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a truth she couldn't ignore. Slowly, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope she had prepared earlier for a charity she supported. It wasn't a gesture of pity, but of quiet respect. Daniel shifted uneasily, sensing her intent. "I don't want charity," he whispered, his voice carrying both pride and weariness. Evelyn stepped closer, her tone soft but steady. "This isn't charity," she replied. "It's gratitude. The world needs men like you, Daniel, fathers who choose love over everything else. Please, let me do this, not for you, but for the daughters who already have a hero." Before he could protest, she slipped the envelope gently into the pocket of his worn coat, her fingers brushing the rough fabric as though sealing a promise. The gesture was small, yet it carried a weight greater than any deal she had ever made. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper only he could hear. "Then let me help anyway, because the world needs more fathers like you." Daniel's throat tightened as he looked at her, speechless. He felt the sting of tears press against his eyes, though he fought to hold them back. In that moment, he understood, she expected nothing in return, no strings, no bargains, just a kindness born of recognition. For so long, he had carried his burden alone, believing the world had forgotten men like him, men who stumbled but kept walking for the sake of their children. But tonight, in a quiet parking lot under flickering lights, a stranger had reminded him that kindness still lived in the world. The weeks that followed carried a quiet transformation. Daniel's life didn't suddenly become easy, bills still came, work was still long, and there were nights when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. But something had shifted. There was a lightness in his steps, a reminder that he wasn't invisible, that the world hadn't left him behind. And his daughters felt it too, their laughter returning like sunlight breaking through clouds. One Saturday morning, the smell of pancakes filled their small kitchen. The girls giggled as Daniel flipped them high in the air, their tiny hands clapping in delight. Syrup dripped messily onto plates, and the kitchen echoed with a joy he hadn't heard in far too long. In the midst of their laughter, a gentle knock came at the door. When Daniel opened it, Evelyn stood there. Not with grand gestures or gifts, but with a warm smile and a plate of fresh fruit in her hands. The girls squealed with excitement and ran to her, wrapping their arms around her legs as if she were the aunt they'd always wished for. Evelyn knelt down, hugging them back, her heart swelling in a way money had never managed to do. Inside, she sat at the small table, her expensive clothes seeming out of place against the worn chairs and chipped plates, yet she looked more at home than she had in years. She wasn't there as a savior, not as a benefactor, but as a friend, someone who had found a family in the most unexpected corner of life. Daniel looked across the table, his heart full. Once, he had feared love and kindness weren't enough. Now he knew better. For in Evelyn's presence, in his daughter's laughter, he discovered that pure, unconditional kindness could not only change a life, it could rebuild one. In the end, Daniel's story was never about wealth or rescue. It was about the strength of love and the quiet power of kindness. A widowed father who had nothing but his devotion to give proved that integrity can outshine even the greatest fortune. And Evelyn, a woman who once measured her worth in riches, discovered that true wealth lies not in possessions, but in the bonds we create and the lives we touch. Their meeting was not fate delivering a fairy tale romance, but life reminding them both of something greater, that compassion, freely given, can heal loneliness, restore hope, and light a path forward. Evelyn found family where she least expected it, and Daniel found strength in knowing he was not alone in his struggle. Together, they revealed a truth that resonates far beyond their small kitchen table, that the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simplest acts of humanity. This is the legacy of their encounter, a reminder that kindness costs nothing, yet it can change everything.